Good morning, everyone. I hope you hear me. My name is Rolf Karlman, and I'm chairman of the Swedish Development Forum, or Swedish Föreningen för utvecklingsfrågor, FUF. And it's my pleasure on behalf of the three organizers who you see up there, UNDP Nordic Office, CONCORD Sweden, and FUF, to welcome you all to this seminar this morning. I'm very glad that we had such a nice response to our invitation. We have actually more or less a full house here this morning. We have chosen a very comprehensive topic for this seminar: global changes and challenges and their implications for development policy. It's a challenge, of course, in itself to try to cover such a big topic in a few hours, but at least I think we can cover at least some significant parts of this question. And so why have we chosen such a big topic? If I may refer you to the invitation you received, with the broad strokes we mentioned a few global changes and challenges will have implications, significant implications for development policy and practices. We have, of course, the old north-south divide, the rich countries, the poor countries. That pattern is changing into a much more complicated or much more diverse pattern of development with countries along a continuum socioeconomically. We have the financial flows where in many countries today official development assistance is dwarfed by remittances and foreign direct investments, at least if you look into sheer volume. We have new actors, old recipient countries becoming donor countries. We have new big development funds coming in and so on. And not least, there is more and more obvious that development cooperation is not something you can see just in isolation, and what used to be development issues, which we just looked at as something for so-called developing countries, is now becoming more of global issues. It's very evident if you look at issues related, for instance, to energy and climate and so on, but also health and other areas. So there's an overlap between what is, let's say, a development agenda in the traditional sense and what is becoming a global agenda in a matter of global public goods. Now, of course, these changes, I think, are well known to most of you who are interested in development issues, and certainly to policymakers in development. So the question is rather, is the response in practices and policies adequate to the combined effect of all these changes? It was striking, for instance, I think for many of us when we read the latest UNDP Human Development Report, where you take what is basically a lot of known things, changes, and add them together, that you really get a striking picture of a very different development landscape. So the question is, will our policy responses, our practice responses, whether we talk about it on the national level or international level, be piecemeal and too little too late, so to speak, and we will develop policies that will help us navigate in a landscape we are leaving, or will it be something that will actually be relevant and guide us in the new development landscape that we are entering? And to come back to the question, why this topic then? Given this, we felt that we had come to this point where it would take these famous steps back and try to look at the wider picture and to see what is going on out there. What are the major changes of relevance to development policy and practices and institutions? And what are these challenges and what are the implications? And today, we'll basically concentrate on this kind of mapping of the significant changes, the challenges they produce and implications and so on. We will not focus this will certainly be relevant also in the Swedish context and to Swedish development policy. We'll, however, will not specifically focus on Swedish development policy today, but we are hoping this way also to set the stage for another seminar which we will hold in exactly 1 month's time on the 23rd of October in the Parliament, where we together with CONCORD, Sweden, and representatives of political parties in Parliament from both the government side and the opposition will arrange a seminar on the Swedish policy for global development, which is today, was issued 10 years ago. And we examine a bit what has happened to it and where should it go from here. Well, today, in order to help us take these steps back and look at the picture, the wider picture, and the development landscape, we are happy to see that we have 3 very distinguished experts to help us guide us along in our discussion. And in order of their appearance, it's Mr. Simon Maxwell, who has a very long CV, but if I just pick a few things, he has been the head of the Overseas Development Institute, executive chair, I understand, of the environmental network, and also advisor to the Parliamentary Committee on Development Cooperation, among other things. We have Ms. Kani Vignaraja, who is presently the United Nations coordinator and UNDP resident representative in Zambia, but has earlier been a senior director at the UNDP headquarters in New York, responsible for, among other things, institutional reform and capacity building. Very happy to have you here today. And then we have Professor Johan Rockström, Professor of Environmental Science, and also now Executive Director of Stockholm Resilience Institute and former Director of the Swedish Environment Institute. So we're very happy to have you here to give us presentations and kick off then later on the discussion. The program today, well, I don't know if you see it from back there, but briefly, we're going to now have these 3 presentations. And after, then we'll have a break, short coffee break, and then we'll have a panel discussion where the 3 speakers will have a chance to reflect a bit with the help of the moderator on their presentations and each other's presentation. And then we move on to a plenary discussion and then some final comments from you. I should also mention that we are filming this seminar today in order to be able to also show it to those who didn't have the opportunity to be here or are living somewhere else than in the Stockholm area. The moderator for today will be Ulrika Moder, who is a member of the board of FUF. And so, once again, I welcome you all here, and I leave the floor to you, Ulrika. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm also very glad to see so many people here. With the first section where we will have the presentations, I will ask you to take down if you just need some clarifying questions. And then for the longer discussion, we will do that after the break. So just some few clarifying questions after each presentation that will help us a bit on the way. And I will not speak now, but hand over the mic, or another mic that Ylva has, to you, Simon.
Brilliant, thank you very much. See, a long CV is easy if you just live long enough. That's my advice. Live forever, then you have a very long CV. It's such a pleasure to be in Sweden because, for 2 reasons. I mean, one is you've been models for those of us in the UK for so many years, on your commitment to development, on poverty, on rights, on multilateralism. You are really, truly a global country. And, you know, it's a privilege to be able to have this conversation with you. But also because now's a really exciting moment. There is the peer review, the DAC peer review on Sweden is published any minute. I hope it will be very positive. And you also have a new minister. Gunilla Carlsson was a friend of mine and I think did a very good job over many years, but I'm also excited about the possibilities that Ellevi Engström has, and we'll come to that challenge that she faces towards the end. I've got half an hour, and I want to make an argument in 4 steps. The first is to say that things are getting better. Don't panic is really the first message. You know, those of us who work in development, we often like to see that the glass is half empty, but we'll see whether or not it is. That changes the whole basis of the conversation about development, which we will talk about. And then there are, as a result, new challenges that we need to deal with. Middle-income countries, the problem of global collective action. What is CEDA for? What are development agencies supposed to be doing in the modern world? And how do we tell that story to the public? And I will conclude, for some reason, back to number one, but anyway, post-2015, leading global change. Let's start with this thing, that the glass is half full, not half empty. You all know this chart, which comes from the UN on whether or not we're going to reach the goals in 2015. This chart used to be full of red. Even 2 or 3 years ago, there was a lot of red on this chart. Now there's a lot of green, and there are still some issues, of course, and Africa still remains behind some of the other regions. But I never thought we would be this far ahead by 2015 as we look likely to be. And if you look at the numbers which underlie some of those colours, what you find is that global poverty has declined really sharply since 1990, except in fragile states, and we'll come back to fragile states. And of course, income is not a very good measure. GDP can be very misleading. You can create GDP without jobs. But on the core human development indicators, just look at what has happened to under 5 mortality as an illustration of the social impact of development over the past generation. In all countries, under 5 mortality has really fallen a lot. And I want to illustrate that with this audience in something a little bit experimental, which is to look at what would have happened to you if you had been born in Tanzania, a country that Sweden has had a long interest in. First of all, in 1960, on this side, and if you were born today on this side. So I'd like you all to stand up, please. Everybody stand up. And the question we're going to look at is what your primary education life chances would have been if you'd been born in 1960. First of all, on this side, 1/4 of you would have died before the age of 5. So all the people sitting in the back 4 rows, please sit down. I did this once with a group of school children, and they all went and pretended to die. You're dead. Thank you very much. Of the remainder of you, 80% didn't get to finish primary education. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. So basically, all of you from this row backwards, sit down. You may sit down, madam. And this is an oversimplification, but broadly speaking, of all those children born in 1960, these are the ones who got to the end of primary school. Congratulations, here's your certificate. Sit down. Good job. Over the generation, the life chances have been transformed because instead of the under 5 mortality being 250, it's now only 50. So the back row, please sit down. You're the only ones. We're very sorry. I mean, you were lovely babies, but we're very sorry you unfortunately have died before the age of, there aren't many of you back then, anyway, died before the age of 5. And of the remainder, 80% have managed to achieve primary education. So probably the next 2 rows, sit down. And so the difference between 1960 and today is that on this side, only 2 rows managed to get through primary education. On this row, what possibilities you offer to Tanzania now as a new and educated generation. Here's your certificate, sit down. We have to be optimistic about development. Development works. Development delivers real change for real people in real countries. And although we will come back to the question of what this means for how we sell the story of development, it's always important to remember what change has been brought about. Of course, not by us, the donors, by the people of those countries and even sometimes by their governments. I've used, of course, as we all do, some of Hans Rosling's statistics to illustrate this a little bit further. Here's the under 5 mortality rate in 1960. Here it is in 2012. And I've adjusted the position of the charts because if you see this one, it goes up as high as 600. This one much lower. This is amazing progress, very widely spread through the world. And it's going to continue. These are IMF forecasts of growth. The blue countries have low growth, that's us. The brown countries have high growth, that's them. 4 of the 5 fastest growing countries in the world are in Africa, and that pattern of growth is spread right across the developing world. And here you see the progress since 2011. Emerging market developing economies up at 6. We're somewhere down here. And this changes, of course, the whole balance of power in the world with the rise of the BRICS. An interesting exercise for you to do when you get back home, I've done this a few times, is to look at the average per capita income in these countries and the average per capita income in these countries, and ask yourself the question, if they're growing at 6 and we're growing at 2, when do we converge? And this will come up later, I'm sure, when Johan gives his presentation. It's quite a frightening thing to do, because the last time I did it, the numbers were slightly different, but we converged in about 2,200, by which time the per capita income in both, because we'd converged developing and developed economies, was of the order of $8 million per capita in 2012 dollars. And I did this calculation, and I spent a lot of time worrying about how I was going to spend all that money in 2,200. How many times can you go to the opera with $8 million? But, of course, the implications for resource use and for planetary boundaries of that rise in income are absolutely immense. Now, nobody pretends that as we look at this story of success, that there are not 1 billion people living in poverty, that there are not, in many countries, 40% of the children who are severely stunted by malnutrition, and that many millions of people are either refugees or otherwise affected by conflict. And we all know that we have a huge job to do. But the job is changing, and the pendulum is swinging from our focus historically on what we do at national level to a focus on other issues outside national boundaries. Here's a simple logical framework. Anybody who works in development has spent half their career writing logical frameworks for projects. You start with the objectives, you come down to the activities, and from the activities you work back up. And broadly speaking, in development, we're seeking something. Let's not discuss what it is. It's well-being, it's human development, it's poverty reduction, and it has a whole lot of different indicators and dimensions: income, health, education, inclusion, participation, and so on. But the important point is this, that in order to achieve these objectives, 2 things have to be right. The first is there has to be national policy which delivers change, and that is about public expenditure and regulatory environment. But there also has to be a favorable international policy environment, which is about some global public goods that I'm going to come back to in a minute. Do one without the other, and you will not deliver development. National policy without international will leave countries highly exposed and highly vulnerable, and vice versa. Historically, in Sweden, in the UK, in most other countries, we focused on the left-hand side. We focused on those issues to do with national policy. And this is just a list, I'm not going to read it, of all the things that donors are currently doing. Focused on poverty reduction, completely obsessed by the search for results. That's worth a conversation later on, and what we mean by results and how we measure them. Vertical initiatives, special vertical funds, Gavi and the Global Fund and so on. Looking at the governance of countries, often with a preference for bilateral aid. I don't really want to talk about that because that is the bread and butter of development as we normally do it. And we need to continue doing it, but we need to continue doing it probably on a smaller scale and in fewer countries than historically. Here's the right-hand side of the things we need to fix. Of course, climate change, highly prominent, and I know the IPCC is meeting here this week to try and finalize their report. The natural resource nexus, global food shocks, financial stability, inclusive globalization, migration. Here's the challenge. Are these things the development agenda of the future in a way that they have not been quite in the past? enormous literature on global public goods. You'll be as familiar with it as I am. And just as an example of why these things matter, I decided not to give you numbers on climate change because the IPCC report is about to come out. But this is from our German colleagues on the global carbon budget. We can put 750 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere by 2050. And the sooner we start, the better. But if we don't start almost immediately, faster than we are now, it actually becomes impossible to reach that target by 2050. You might ask me, how much is a gigaton? I asked myself that question. It's enough CO2 to fill the Black Sea. In the UK, whenever we have this kind of question, we say it's about as big as Wales, or about the height of the Eiffel Tower. I have no idea how big the Black Sea is, but anyway, a gigaton would fill the Black Sea. To bring this into a human dimension, I find this picture phenomenally powerful. On the left, and in brown, dark and light, you have the areas of Uganda that are suitable for growing coffee today. Coffee, of course, is the biggest export in Uganda, the biggest employer, a large source of government revenue. Temperature goes up by 2 degrees, coffee disappears from Uganda. And already in Uganda, in Rwanda, in Kenya, we see these hugely important traditional crops being put under enormous stress because of a rising temperature and sometimes because of changes in rainfall as well. In Kenya, tea is going to move, I think it's 2,000 feet up the mountain. All the traditional tea areas will no longer be able to grow tea. There's a famous hotel in Kenya, in Kisii, in Kericho, called the Tea Hotel. And I've said before, it should be renamed the Hot Water Hotel, because there won't be any tea to put in the hot water. And if you're running Uganda, you have many things to worry about. Poverty today, your relations with your neighbors, the discovery of oil. But actually, something like this should make any leader stop in their tracks and think about how they're going to manage the problems of the future. That's just an example of the kinds of global challenges. There are many others on that earlier list. Food crises is a very important one. So where does this leave us in terms of the future of development cooperation? Well, I think we'll be worried about poverty, but we'll be worried less about poverty than we are today. We'll be worried more about global public goods. Of course, we'll still focus on poor countries, but we'll be thinking about poor and middle-income countries. Yes, we'll be thinking about aid, but we also need to think about all the other things that shape that international environment on the policy side. Will we have aid departments? I don't think so. I think we'll have international development or global public policy departments within government. We'll be working not in single ministries, but across the whole of government. We'll be thinking not about bilateral relationships between one country and another, but about how we shape a global system which works for the benefit of all. We'll be working in different kinds of partnerships, and instead of talking about aid effectiveness, we'll be talking about entitlement and the right that countries have to finance. That's a pretty substantial change that ministers have to handle over the forthcoming period. This is not development as we've known it since I started in 1970. It's a completely different way of thinking about the mission and the passion that we have. And some questions arise. The first one is, what do we do about aid if there aren't any poor countries anymore? That's not a trivial question. Actually, go to the CEDA website, and that's one of the first things that the CEDA website says is there are now more and more middle-income countries. This is a table by my colleague Jonathan Glennie, and it's already out of date. But you can just see that even in 8 years, the number of low-income countries has fallen from 61 to 40. The number's out of date. It's now 33. Spin forward 5 years, and it'll probably be down to the 20s. Spin forward to 2025, look at the time scale for the post-2015 global goals. We'll be talking about fewer than 20 low-income countries, and probably most of those will be conflict-afflicted or fragile states. That's not business as usual. That is absolutely not business as usual for development ministries. Now, there's a big debate, I'm sure in your country, certainly in my country, about whether we should provide aid to low-income countries, to middle-income countries. India, South Africa, the Latin American countries. I think it's fairly clear that, well, let me not say it's fairly clear, there's a big debate in our countries about whether or not the fact that a country has poor people qualifies it for aid. India, of course, has the highest load of poverty and the highest load of undernutrition in the world. But as we always say in the UK, they have a space program, they host the Olympic Games, they own half of British industry. They are big investors in the UK. They have reserves of $300 billion. I'm speaking before the currency crisis, but in principle, they have very large reserves. Why do we think it's necessary for us to give India a few $100 million in order to help with poverty when they have so much they could do themselves if they wanted to? I call this the poverty in Saudi Arabia problem. You know, say there are poor people in Saudi Arabia. Is it our responsibility in Stockholm or in London to rush there with an aid program and try to help? I think there's probably a role for NGOs. But I can see very little case for government-to-government support in lower middle-income countries or upper middle-income countries. And that changes the business that we are in. And I know that's a controversial thing to say, and I'm sure people will want to come back and talk about it a little more. The second big challenge, the first big challenge, what are we going to do about middle-income countries? The second big challenge is that if we're going to be worried about these global public goods and the new environment of development, how do we deliver change? How do we manage to get agreement? And my goodness, look at the climate talks if you want to see how difficult that is. But more generally, look at Syria and all the problems we have in securing international agreement on almost anything. Well, again, there's a literature. And on the right, we have Maxwell's 8-step program for delivering global solutions, which came from when I was working on UN reform. But very similar principles in all these books, including this one recently published by Ian Goldin from Oxford. Divided Nations. It's called Why Global Governance is Failing and What We Can Do About It. Why global governance is failing. There's no trust. The incentives are wrong. The institutions don't exist to deliver long-term change. A different way of doing business is required. For Sweden, that's an interesting challenge because you have choices to make. All ministers have choices to make in how they allocate their time, their money, and their political capital. Put it all through the World Bank. Work entirely through the EU. Or the UN, or the Nordic Council. If you're Sweden, you have a slightly different range of opportunities than we do in the UK. But I did find this wonderful chart, which is from Wikipedia, so I'm sure it's 100% accurate, of Sweden's participation in international organizations. And you're not in the G20 or in the G8, but you are in the G6, the G9, and the G10. Whatever they might be. You're in lots of UN organizations, and I was very excited to discover that Sweden is a member of the Young Electricians, which seems to me to offer huge potential for electrifying the world in policy terms. So you're the Minister of Development Cooperation. How are you going to stitch together an international system which will deal with health pandemics, which will solve the financial imbalances in the world, which will deal with food crises, and of course deal with climate change through this range of organizations? What an exciting and interesting challenge that is for your new ministers. You can't answer that question. You can't answer that question if the people you have working for you, and if you yourself are somebody whose only expertise is in how to manage primary health centers in Tanzania. That's a skill set which is really important, but it's not the only skill set you need, because you have to manage these other things as well. The Center for Global Development famously have done their Global Development Index, looking at aid and trade and investment, migration, environment, security, and technology transfer. I'm so pleased to see that Sweden is right up at the top. Congratulations. You're doing a lot better than some other countries on this list, including the United Kingdom. And that shows that for all sorts of reasons, you're able to stitch together by accident or by design policy which is beneficial to developing countries. You also rate very highly on this index, which is one prepared by colleagues at ODI and Brookings on how development agencies are having to reinvent themselves in order to deal with these new challenges. And broadly speaking, if you're an old-style aid agency which simply delivers projects, you're at the top of this list. If you're engaged in the new global agenda, you come in the green area, and Sweden comes, along with Denmark and Finland, by the way, very close to the top, although it's presented kind of the other way around. I used to think about this a lot in relation to aid agencies, and identified 4 kinds of people who work for aid agencies. In the old days, the people who work for aid agencies, I described them as spanners. They were the people who knew how to build roads and drainage systems and irrigation canals and bridges and power stations. Hard, practical, competent, committed engineers and project planners, project designers. Most aid agencies fired all those people at the end of the 1990s and the early 2000s because that wasn't what they thought development needed to be about. They hired these people instead, who were the people who knew how to deliver social welfare programs to villages out in the developing world, delivering the spoon, delivering services. I don't know whether this child is Swedish, but the jam looks delicious. In fact, I'm sure I bumped into this person last time I was in Cedar. We had lots of those in the UK Development Agency. They all got fired. Because by the early 2000s, the mid-2000s, the people who were dominating in the aid business were the accountants, the people who could turn on the tap of budget support and sector budget support. You wanted a new computer, you wanted the best office, you wanted air conditioning, you wanted the new Toyota. The thing to do was to become the budget support expert, take a degree in accountancy, and you could be sure of a brilliant career in development. We're going to have to fire all those people because the people we're going to need in the future. I had a lot of trouble with the alliteration. Spanner, spoon, spigot. I used to use spyglass, but I needed a word beginning with sp that would identify something different, which is going outside to work with the international system. So I used to use a spyglass, but it seemed a little bit of a passive word. So here we are springing into action in order to deliver a deal on climate change or a solution to Syria or even Somalia. I once did a lecture for the DFID social anthropologists, the social development advisors in DFID. They were fantastic people. They are fantastic people. They know everything you could possibly want to know about the marriage customs of tribals in Myanmar or Nepal. Well-trained, competent, and of course this is a cruel and unfair and entirely incorrect caricature, but they are really good social anthropologists. My thought for them was that in the future we may need people who understand about the marriage customs of tribals in Myanmar, but much more important will be to understand the marriage customs of members of the General Assembly. Because actually it's understanding the anthropology of that policy process that would make a real contribution to producing the global deal. We're not talking about CEDA today. I don't know what kinds of competencies CEDA has, but it does seem to me that any development agency is going to have to work in a different way and work across government so that policy coherence becomes the mantra. It's about trade and climate and agricultural policy and all the many other aspects. What kinds of cabinet committees, what kinds of cross-government structures do we need to deliver genuinely joined-up thinking? This is a huge problem in all our countries and in all the multilaterals, including in Europe. So let me come to my penultimate point in the last 5 minutes. This gives us a real problem. I've described a situation in which the world has changed. We have the rise of new powers. We have much more rapid growth in developing countries. We have decreasing numbers of low-income countries. We have probably a smaller need for traditional aid, but we have a hugely expanded need for a new kind of global conversation, global collaboration, and global partnership. How do we sell this to people? When the traditional way of presenting development aid has been through the kinds of images that we see in this slide. These are the pictures that move us. Of course, I've stolen all these from the internet, but this one in particular almost makes me weep every time I look at it as a father and a grandfather. And this is the kind of thing that brought me into development, and I expect brought most of you into development. Here we have both the negative and the positive, tsunamis and famine and refugee camps, but also the benefits of water and healthcare and education. But in important ways, this is old development, not new development. New development would be talking to people about conflict, about corruption, perhaps, about the international drugs trade, about crime. These are much more difficult topics to have a conversation about. And I think it presents leaders and us with a problem. To educate the public, to make development sound too simple, to understand the complexities, and particularly today when we wake up and read about both the attack in Nairobi and the suicide bombing in Peshawar, with dozens of people killed in both cases. It's very hard to have the conversation with people that is not a very simplistic conversation based on these rather traditional ideas of development. And I think that is a huge challenge for leaders in the future. Now, I'm nearly finished, luckily. All of this is relevant to the conversation about post-2015, which I'm sure we'll hear about more later on. I'm amazed at how much time and effort is going into producing these post-2015 goals. The size, the scale, the geographical coverage of the consultations. And I don't actually think it's that difficult. But there are two important issues that drive this whole discussion about post-2015, which offer interesting opportunities for progressive development countries like Sweden and progressive development agencies. The first, of course, to start from the bottom, is the idea of having one set of goals, not two. So not having poverty goals on the one hand and environment goals on the other, but having goals which link poverty and environment. Sustainable development captures that because it talks about economic, social, and environmental goals. But it's a really hard thing to deliver because there are so many conflicts still, particularly actually about the environment side. But the other big idea about post-2015, which is really exciting, is that these should be global goals and not restricted to developing countries. And that's important because as we have fewer and fewer low-income countries, to have global goals which only refer to the poorest countries actually doesn't get us very far. Because there are only, whatever it is going to be, 20 countries left by 2020. So we need universal goals, which recognize people's rights and their agency, and are not just about delivering income poverty changes, but all those other aspects of well-being that I talked about earlier on. And those goals need to apply not just to Tanzania and Burkina Faso and Ethiopia and India, but also to Sweden and the UK. And I think we're desperately looking for a country in the north that would commit to laying out its own plans for having a 2025 or 2030 world and what they might do about it. Tackling their own poverty, but also tackling social exclusion and inequality in the world as a whole. So to come to the end, this is the challenge, I think, facing CEDA, facing Sweden, facing CEDA, and facing your new minister. It's to take this extremely successful, historic, easy to explain, and powerful model of development. And Sweden, as I said at the beginning, has been a pioneer in all those ways. Taking that extremely powerful, simple, easy to explain model and changing it into something else, which is equally effective, equally well explained, but which doesn't just tackle the problems of residual poverty in developing countries, although we must make sure we don't forget those problems, but actually makes the case for a completely different way of doing business. And in the last few months, I've been studying the psychology. Perhaps this is another conversation, but what kinds of speeches do leaders make when they want to make this point? Watch Obama at work, for example. But a very good book I recommend to you is The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, about how to pitch your speeches and your presentation so as to appeal not just to empathy, but also to self-interest, to duty, to our sacred rights. I wrote, when I reviewed the book, what I thought would be a great speech for Obama on climate, 2 paragraphs for his speech. And the same day I put it on my website, lo and behold, he gave his inauguration speech and had 2 paragraphs exactly about climate, pitched much better than mine, but attacking all those different ways of presenting. Setting out a vision and managing change. That's the task, I think, that CEDA can help with, precisely because you're pioneers and you don't just have the possibility, but I think you have a responsibility to do this in the future. There's much more on all this on my website and on 2015, on the future of aid and so on. And I would love it if you followed me on Twitter, because I want to have as many follows as Justin Bieber. Justin Bieber has several million. I think I have about 10. So there is scope for improvement. But I'd leave you with the picture of your new minister and with the hope that you can continue to be the pioneers you have been for so many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And as it happens, our Minister for Development Cooperation also is responsible for the policy for global development. So we will see how she will handle that responsibility. I will let you ask Simon now. Yeah, but you can use my mic later on. Just a few clarifying questions, if we have some in the audience. Everything was crystal clear. Well, I'm sure then that the following speakers will also pick up some of the aspects that you were bringing to us. So I welcome you, Kenny.
Thank you. First to say it's really a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Swedish Development Forum and CONCORD and our UNDP Nordic office for luring me out of the peace of Lusaka to be here with you. And really to say we hadn't intended the timing to be so opportunistic, but I think with the debate and the reflection you are going through here, I hope we can provide also some of that, our own reflections to guide yours. Now, I'd like to pick up, it's wonderful to follow Simon in this, because I'd like to pick up on the alliteration of that glass is half full, because we do have a tendency overall to look at a world with somewhat pessimistic, despairing eyes. And to say that from where I sit in Zambia, which is a growing low middle income country today, there is optimism. There's a lot of things that still have to happen, but I'd like to focus my presentation on taking it from a glass is half full and saying what can we all do as a global community to push it to a glass that is full, so that we really have a sense of that transformation that is happening, but what we can do to move it forward. So very quickly, in terms of the global rebalancing that is happening, and I'm not going to go through all of the facts, but just looking at the graph there, we are seeing a significant shift, as the previous speaker has also said. And if I just take one of those trends from between the last 1950 to 2050, we're going to see a significant move in the economic leaders, producers, and consumers of the world. So yes, the South is rising dramatically, but not all of it is rising together. And coming from this is a set of both global and local tensions that we've got to look at how we address them. Do we have the right policy mix, the right institutions to really deal with this fast-changing world? If we look at the middle class, which in many countries, north, south, east, west, has been really the driver that has moved change, whether it's economic change or political change or social change, what are we seeing across the world as this group, and what are they doing? And as the world's population grows, you see the growing middle class, including in the South, led tremendously by a surge in Asia, where by 2030, the South will account for 70% of global total consumption expenditure. Now, at the same time, and this is where we've got to walk on 2 feet, we are seeing that over 1 billion people still live in extreme poverty. And if I look at Zambia as a microcosm of that, that growth in the middle class is very small, but what we're seeing is tremendously rapid growth in inequality. So it's a very contrasting and confusing development picture. And I've taken sub-Saharan Africa as an illustration, given the focus and the attention outside of only the conflict and post-conflict countries, but even in Africa, to see, if you look at it from an economic growth picture, and then if you look at it from the human development story, are we able to reflect on these two stories at the same time? Because they are giving us two very different pictures. So you've heard of all of the Africa is rising, you know, the light is shining on Africa, investments coming in, significant over the 6-7 years, significant average growth rates, new money flowing into the continent, and sound macroeconomic management in most of the countries. Now let's look at the human development story, where the majority of the countries are in the low human development category. You have very high inequalities, both income inequality, gender inequalities, you name it. You're seeing it across the board. You see undernourishment rearing its head again. And these are issues that get hidden because even in countries that have managed to move on targets that have to do with hunger, the hidden lack of nutrition, for example, or the hidden epidemics are really rearing their head. I mean, Africa is a continent, ironically, that has one of the fastest spikes now in non-communicable diseases. Whereas we had looked at Africa for malaria, TB, cholera, HIV. And now you're seeing one of the largest numbers in terms of diabetes, blood pressure, cholesterol, etc. Spikes coming in. The numbers of women who die at childbirth is just horrendous. It's a human rights and an ethical issue that we've got to look at. And as has been, it's not necessarily that all of this can be tackled with science and technical intervention. So what makes for some of this, where from an income point of view and a middle-class growth of prosperity in terms of national and global averages, maybe we're seeing that convergence. And as Simon said, there are less and less poor countries, but with tremendous local divergence. So what are we putting it to? Because we've got to look for where we think, where does this story emanate from? And if we don't understand some of that, then our response to it still remains a story of yesteryear. So is it some of the fundamentals that we're not getting right as leaders of countries, or our institutions? Is it the capacity in the policy making and the policy delivery? Is it that a lot of this just has to do with world markets? In Zambia, for example, if the Chinese stop buying copper and stocking up piles of copper, it'll drive world prices of copper down and the economy tanks within 2 weeks. Is there a peace dividend that's really kicking in now so that we're seeing countries that went through tremendous conflict and war really coming back up and gaining and benefiting from the peace dividend? Is that why we're seeing some of the positive moving these countries forward? Is new knowledge and technology, new ways of doing things, helping countries leapfrog going forward? So what really works if we put a more just and a more balanced, sustainable development globally at the heart of things? What really is it that is going to trigger this over a period of time? Now, I want us to focus for a minute on this issue of inequality. If I look at the poverty targets globally, we've met that. MDG 1, just through what Brazil, China, and India has done, dramatically reduced the proportion of income poor. Because that's how we were measuring poverty. There's an income figure, and as Simon said, the accountants took over. So we've got that number, and we've pushed X numbers above that figure, and the world is doing just fine. Now, there's a tremendous contrast between what Brazil is doing and what India is doing. So every point of growth today in Brazil actually cuts poverty at a much faster rate than it does in India. And the divergence there is much less. So there's something that Brazil is doing that's reducing inequalities that we're still to be doing in India or even in China. Having worked for years in Vietnam, we can see that they're also managing to reduce poverty while holding lower levels of inequality, although that now again there's a tendency to diverge there. But certainly they're doing something there that's holding inequality in place as well. Ghana and Ethiopia, if you look at the African continent, certainly faring better on this score than much of the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in the southern cone. Big human development strides. If you look at the Human Development Index, you'll see that the countries in that blue box there are really taking large strides forward for very different reasons, but it'll be interesting to see again some of the policy and institutional mix going on, plus some of the dividends for some of a post-conflict period coming through. So what are they doing differently? what is it that allows some of these countries to really go in for a more balanced trajectory and not just a growing economic story, but a diminishing value that really impacts a bigger number of people's lives? And you really do see a different pragmatic mix of policy choices, where the countries that have decided to take some very special measures, and we can discuss some of this in the open discussion, it also really comes down to strategic leadership and the leaders really engaging and understanding this convergence between what is local and global and their country's place in that picture. And one of those is, in fact, opening up a different kind of trade, technology, set of investment choices, but backed by an institutional capacity back home. So that you go in with eyes open and you manage your place in that global marketplace. The countries that have held particularly sustained investment in education, health and nutrition, much beyond the life of a single political cycle. The leaders that have had the guts to say, I'm in this for the long haul, in terms of an investment, even if my 5-year term will soon come up. Those particularly who've invested long term in education are seeing and reaping the dividends of this. When it comes to social security, again, a switch in gear to see this as a human capital investment and not just as a palliative and a band-aid that comes as an afterthought. And at the end of the day, really the capacity to deliver. Because we're all very good at these log frames, as we know, and designs and plans. We're even very good at ratifying international conventions. Whether we then localize that and really embed the ability to deliver on these commitments is a whole nother matter. Now, where does ODA come into this picture? And it's really been up and down, even in terms of volume and where it's going. And the traditional packages of ODA have been on the decline in the last couple of years. But that's just a very front page flush of what we are seeing. Let's look a little bit deeper at the changing face of ODA. No matter how you count it, ODA is flowing today. The majority of it is going to middle-income countries. So although we think that it is going for the poorest or into conflict areas, the numbers are telling a different story. Even in Africa, it is the lower middle-income countries and the middle-income countries that gets the lion's share of global ODA. Now, what is on the upswing, really, are a series of global funds, most of them vertical, I might even say vertically challenged global funds. The climate financing, a lot of blended packages of private and public funding mixes coming in. New kind of social innovation funds. Then you have the Millennium Challenge account, the PEPFARs of this world. So there is the volume of money hasn't actually shifted. So we may be we're counting in a different space, but the money is flowing in is really quite significant. And that includes south to south. And we've got to understand this new money coming in from China, from Brazil, from India, from South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, significant monies coming in. And they don't count it in the same way. These are now not in the same kind of results and accounting matrices that the OECD makes us all fill up 16 times a year. It's a completely different space. And yet it's large money coming in. So let me take this home to Zambia, where we have a lot of this money flowing in, and say 8 years of growth, 6 to 7% and growing, forecasted even higher for the next 4 or 5 years. One of the 10 fastest growing economies in Africa, holding steady on macroeconomic stability, single-digit inflation, and now 163 out of 187 has not moved on the Human Development Index, has held steady with all of this going on the blue column. This is what we see on the red side. Now, why do I say the glass is still half full and growing? It was only 20 years ago where if you were Zambian, your average life expectancy was 29 years old because AIDS removed such a large group from that age between 18 and about 45, which is where it had been. So a 20-year drop in life expectancy. So this is the build back, and it's only taken 20 years to get back what was lost. So there is a strong story, and we sometimes, and the reason I've even put this up there is to say that even with this, you've got to understand where we've come from. And there is a surge of effort to try and address these. But sometimes the addressing of these is still in traditional ways that are not making those leaps and bounds, and in fact, certainly, some of us in the development community, the international community, haven't moved to the spring group, if you wish, to take it forward. Now, in Zambia, there is a strong conversation about the fact that it's not budget support that's doing this, and it's not the spanners and the spoons. So we've really got to come together to understand what it is that are the enablers that really open the doors for that kind of springboard to take this forward. You cannot have countries engaging dynamically in a global environment if 2/3 of those countries' children still who go into primary school don't complete secondary school. So it is the global and local agenda really having to meet and see how they best serve each other. So let us be very real about the shifting patterns of development finance. Much of Africa's development is being financed by Africa. And how do you then engage in that conversation? Because no more can you say, well, you know, I'm bringing this money and I'm going to attach these 6 conditionalities to it. And if you don't agree to those conditionalities, I'm taking my money out. Well, they're saying, well, go ahead. So we've got to think beyond a package that's purely led by what used to be the financiers of development. They no longer are. And yet, that finance has such a critical role to play when it's packaged together with other things. And that's what I'd like to look at now. If you just look at South Africa alone, South Africa finances in the African continent, they're way beyond the 0.7% target. We don't even talk about that. We talk about the excitement of a few countries in the north that have reached that target, when the financial flows have really gone someplace else. So we've got to focus on a bigger picture. So I'd like to close by saying, what does this all mean now for an era of new international governance? And can we really just continue talking about poverty reduction when it's not converting, whatever we're doing is not even converting growth into poverty reduction? We're seeing growing inequality and much of the world rising up, because inequality and injustice go hand in hand. And if we're not talking to that, and our governing instruments and our aid instruments aren't able to grapple with this more complex interplay, then we're still talking to, yes, we can move another 3.5 people out of extreme poverty, and then what? So are we really looking at a more just distribution of both policy mixes and finance that goes with it? Are we truly including a different set of people, a growing group that's out of state borders and is a global community asking for a different way of doing things? Have we truly come into a more comfortable place? Because there's a lot of discomfort taking all of this in. It shakes our traditional comfort zones or broader alliances. And interestingly here, it's very important to see that we've got to come together to address these global challenges. Because just like in Uganda, we've already lost coffee and tea in Zambia. And for how long are we going to rely on diminishing copper resources? Just last year, the devastation, because the rains came late, of the army worms that came in and just ate up 2/3 of the crops in Zambia. Just devastating. Thank goodness the Chinese bought more copper. So it's an issue that together there are a set of global vulnerabilities that are very local, and local vulnerabilities that cause for global shocks. So it's a different set of alliances. And the integration, again, not a comfort zone, but a conversation you are having here via domestic policy. Is there a different way that we can integrate our trade policies, our foreign policy, the political and economic policies, so that they address better and together these issues that we're talking about? And as the song says, we really can't have one without the other. These are now, it's a reality. And maybe we have oversimplified because we let the accountants take over. So I'd like to leave with a concluding message that if we are to convert the growth we are seeing, and the growth in the middle income kind of block and the middle class, truly into reducing the injustices and the inequalities, whether at local level or at global level, it's a different set of political and public policy choices, and then the institutions that really to go with it. And that's the hardest part. That's the last mile. So we've come a long way on those MDGs, but for that final kind of conversion to a better place, the walking that last mile, that's going to be the toughest. But I think with a different mix that we're putting on the table, it will make the difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenny. It seems that you agree that the glass is half full, but at the same time there are some people not having anything to drink in some countries, and some people having perhaps a full glass. I will give the opportunity if you want to have some clarifying questions. You want to keep listening. So then keep your questions for the discussion later on, and I welcome you, Johan.
Fill up the glass to make a glass analogy. So thank you and good morning, and wonderful to come after Kani and Simon. And what I will do is two things. One is try to combine your talks and agree, and I do agree that the glass is half full, but I'll argue that there's a crack in the glass. And that's the challenge. It's leaking, and we know that when water is leaking, in the end you take big risks. But the emphasis of my talk is really to give an update of the scientific thinking around the integrated, unified framework that I think you've been emphasizing, Simon, and about your last point there, Kani, that we need to truly connect both the social, economic, equity, governance, humanitarian, with the big insight that we've reached the globalized phase of environmental risks. So there is a truly integrated and unified opportunity and agenda that we need to grasp in order to move forward. And I think the kind of crack in the glass really comes out of quite a pronounced insight that, you know, we've often talked of the global environmental risks, perhaps climate change most prominently, as something that's happening way in the future. But as you both have pointed out, and I think we're starting to see so much empirical evidence, it's actually hitting already today. And it's hitting everywhere. When the freak hurricane Sandy suddenly veers right into Manhattan and a bit symbolically puts even Wall Street under 3 meters of water, connecting the financial sector with global environmental change, it's something that cannot be explained easily, because normally these hurricanes continue along the US East Coast and go out in the Atlantic. The only scientific explanation is the collapse of the Arctic vortex in 2008. So you have such an accelerated ice melt of sea ice, warming up the temperatures in the Arctic, and the entire weather system that keeps high-pressure cold air in the Arctic collapsed. That's a fact. Moving down high-pressure cold air to lower latitudes could explain the cold Swedish winters over the past 2 or 3 years, but also creating high pressures that probably pushed the hurricane right into over land. And there's scientific papers now coming out showing that it's very difficult to explain this sudden, very, very strong impact on the federal economy in the US without factoring climate change. You may have seen this paper that came out recently showing that if we have a tipping point in terms of methane release from the under seabed thawing permafrost in Siberia, you could have a shock to the global economy of in the order of $50 trillion US, which is roughly the same size as the global economy. There's a whole battery of scientific papers now coming out showing that the Arab Spring could not have gone to scale if it hadn't been for the fact that you had a 120% rise in phosphorus prices, which is the key for modern agriculture, if it hadn't been for an over 100% rise in oil prices, and that Putin and Rudd, the prime ministers of Australia and Russia, shut their export borders of food because of forest fires and drought. Probably the first example of a regional scale social ecological shock destabilizing a whole region socially. We've never seen that ever before in the presence of modern human civilizations on Earth. And of course, the 12 years drought in Australia, but we had the freak floods in Mexico just 2 days back, and Kani referring back to different shocks occurring at a higher frequency. NASA now putting out data showing that if we just compare the past 50 years, 1955, the likelihood that you would have a so-called 3 sigma event in terms of weather extremes. 3 sigma events is what statisticians call things that should happen less than once in 1,000 years. Now, the number of pixels on Earth that were subject to that kind of impact in 1955 was roughly 1%. So of course it occurred. There were always freak events occurring somewhere, but on 1% on average. 2012, the surface was 15%. So there's a shift in the whole normal distribution where not the extreme, the ultra extreme has become part of something that occurs in the everyday planning and can hit anywhere in the world, both tropical and temperate, but the likelihood of hitting tropical poor countries is higher. So it is a new situation, which we now need to, so to say, factor in to our development strategies. So normally, the community outside of science portrays turbulence and shocks in this way. This is the Lehman Brothers vortex in 2008. But as you may be aware, even The Economist welcomed humanity to the Anthropocene roughly a year back. So the Anthropocene is the scientific word for the insight that why are we seeing these shocks and disturbances to the economy, which could undermine development? Well, it's because we've entered a whole new geological era, the Anthropocene, anthros for humans. 7 billion people multiplied by industrial metabolism today constitutes a geological force of change. In simple words, we're starting to see evidence that we're hitting the ceiling of the ecological capacity of planet Earth to support the modern world as we know it. Now, The Economist, and I do this for you, Simon, as a Brit. It's a British, highly respected business weekly, and they have this wonderful British citation of the understatement type signal of how science feels today, and it is as follows: that when reality is changing faster than theory stipulates it should, a certain amount of nervousness is a reasonable response. And this is, I think, encapsulates science today. Things are changed faster, and IPCC on Friday will be releasing its Working Group 1 report and the 5th assessment. And one conclusion will be that we're seeing change occurring faster already at lower temperatures than we had expected. So this is the crack in the glass. How can we then translate that in a way of, so to say, ensuring that the glass is not only half full or kept half full, but also can be filled up? Well, Ban Ki-moon organized, as you may be aware, a high-level panel on global sustainability. I think it's the first report ever with high-level representatives from heads of state and really, really heavyweight leaders from business saying that, yes, we can no longer exclude non-linear changes in the Earth system. And yes, and this is, I think, the most prominent message that this report's come out with, that today global sustainability is a prerequisite for poverty alleviation. I mean, just think of that a little while. Global sustainability is now a prerequisite for poverty alleviation. It means suddenly that we need to meet global sustainability criteria, even to lift the Burkinabean farmer out of poverty or the urban dweller in New Delhi. There's this ultra connectivity. Thomas Friedman, the columnist of New York Times, states it, I think, very nicely to say we've gone from a connected to a hyper-connected world, from a hyper-connected world to a totally interdependent world. It means that even a finance minister in Sweden depends on the Borneo rainforest being intact. That Isabella Teixeira, the Minister for the Environment in Brazil, actually works actively to keep the Amazon rainforest. That the Arctic region must be maintained because these are regulatory biomes that have feedbacks right into the totally interdependent economy in the world. So the conclusion is that we've operated and still operate a world where we assume growth without limits. As Simon points out, we're rushing in a very positive way towards a world where, you know, we're moving from 1.5 billion people in the world with the kind of lifestyle that's represented by ourselves in this room to 4, 5, 6 billion people with a purchasing power equivalent to an average European. This is fantastic. This is finally taking the big momentum on development. We have a world growth in the world economy projected of 300% over the next 37 years. Now, this occurs still under a model where we assume that the planet is this strong, resilient system that simply can't take externalities. We can just shove our pressures into an ever-forgiving Earth system. And now we're starting to see for the first time that the Earth system is sending invoices back into the economy. And this is the shift. And I think there's growing scientific evidence that the story then on development is not about limits to growth, it's about growth within limits. It's about recognizing that innovation, transformation, behavioral change, partnerships, cooperation allows us to grow. We can have a discussion of what growth is. I would argue that growth is the wrong word. It should be focusing on human well-being and focusing on what is a happy life instead of economic growth. Growth can be a good vehicle for a happy life. But it's a question of recognizing that we have biophysical limits, and science in the upper right-hand corner is starting to communicate this in a very, very prominent way. The forefront document there is the State of the Planet Declaration. 3,600 global environmental change scientists gather in London 3 months before the Rio +20 meeting last year to say with one voice that we are in the Anthropocene, we need a world transformation to a new development paradigm. Why is this so urgent? Well, Simon put it forward. This is just a backup to complement that. As you may recall, when the IPCC launched its 4th report 5 years back, they presented a number of climate scenarios up until mid this century. They had the A1 family in red here, which they were very criticized for because this was the worst case scenario. This was taking the world to a risk of 4 to 6 degrees warming. This was, you know, business as usual. We do nothing on emission of greenhouse gases. World population continues to grow. Why, dear IPCC, scare the world with such a dark doom and gloom scenario? The blue one is the desired pathway of a 75% chance of staying under 2 degrees. It's the 80% reduction of emissions of greenhouse gases compared to 1990. The black dots is what Glenn Peters and colleagues show where we are today. So we're following the 4-degree line. And this is why the World Bank released its 4-degree report. It wasn't to scare humanity, it was to show that we're taking enormous risks. We're not there in any way, but we're taking enormous risks because we're moving against this pathway. And why do we need to be so nervous? Well, it's because everything we've learned about the Earth system is that we have junctures where we might push on buttons and where we can have self-accelerating change, which we do no longer control at all. So it could well be that we are, so to say, just the aperitif with our emission of greenhouse gases. We turn up the heat slightly and then start self-reinforcing, self-regulating feedbacks. For example, when ice changes color when it melts. A white surface reflects 90% of heat back to space. A dark color absorbs more than 50%. The ice sheets on Earth are coolers, maintaining an equilibrium, which is the equilibrium we've had for the past 10,000 years, which is the only equilibrium we know that can support the modern world as we know it. We learned in school to call this the Holocene. So this is the scientific nightmare, that we are at a very decisive phase where we could trigger feedbacks that can take us in a trajectory where it goes, so to say, beyond human control. We're not there yet, but this is the nervousness. IPCC's 5th assessment will be putting this forward for the first time. We see for development that this has major manifestations. This is unpublished data so far, but it's the biggest ever integration of global climate models and water models to show in a 2-degree future, where are the regions where we'll see in red the largest impact on freshwater decline with over 25%. Now, the interesting part with this map is that North Africa and Southern Europe are amongst the most hardly hit. But you see also some tendencies that we might have more rainfall in parts of Africa, which most likely is not a positive because it will be more intensive tropical storms. So there's an intensification of freshwater, which is the underlying core of all economic growth. And what's the evidence for that? Well, this is, I think, the best way of expressing why water in this example is so important. This is the last 100 years of development and an estimate of the number of people in the world suffering from water scarcity. So 3.5 billion people today still do not have enough fresh water to, so to say, meet their basic human needs. And the dotted lines is our exponential growth of trying to solve this issue. These are the number of dams and reservoirs and irrigation systems. So we've been chasing our own tail in a stable world where the hydrological cycle has been something we can trust. It's been reasonably predictable. Rainy seasons start roughly when we expect them to do. But we're moving towards this situation of growing uncertainty. So this is to show that we can no longer decouple, which Simon pointed out, the poverty agenda with the sustainability agenda. And this is why we consider that we need to now turn a page. And to summarize this part, before just talking briefly of a new framework, it goes as following. So yes, we have just one life support system, which is the basis for the development agenda. We're increasingly living on a crowded planet, but the message from science is, unfortunately, that we're not at the end of a journey of the social environmental challenges. We've just reached the first course. We're kind of entering the main course of our challenges. The first pointed out so eloquently by Kani and Simon that it's now that the social positive momentum is starting in the world. It's now that we're going to scale with truly being able to end poverty in the world, in a world committed to 9 billion people. But the science method is that it is now that we're starting to see the feedbacks in the Earth system. It is now that we're starting to see evidence that we're reaching a saturation point in terms of, for example, the climate system. It is in spring 2013 we reached 450 ppm on all greenhouse gases, which is, by all accounts, the danger ceiling in terms of committing ourselves to 2 degrees. So it is now it starts, the new agenda for global development. So how could a framework then look like to address this new reality? Well, to begin with, it's just to start, and this has been, I think, a bit of the theme today, that so far what is on the table are kind of unattractive alternatives. It's either you say, oh, gee, the party is over. You know, we've had a good time. Sorry, dear poor nations, but we can no longer offer you any cheap energy, and we can offer you some extractive resources, and we can no longer cut down any forests. So the party is over, and you simply have to cope with that. The second one is how all negotiations go today. It's about burden sharing. It's about saying, this is real big cost. It's really tough, and we will contract a bit, we rich countries, and you can grow for a while, but then you converge. And this is the negotiations, and it's not so surprising then that this translates to a trench war where every head of negotiation has a responsibility to report back the best deal for my country, because it's all about burdens. And the third one, which doesn't come up so clearly, is business as usual. You just put the head in the sand, cross your fingers, nothing will happen. Science has somehow got it wrong, or will hope for the best. And I would argue this is where we are largely today. But there's clearly a growing fourth pathway. The attractive story of a transition into a sustainable future which delivers both on human well-being and on sustainability, and to use sustainability as the very vehicle for human well-being. And the reason why this story is starting to emerge a bit much more prominently is that it's attached with more than rhetorics. It's attached with much more real evidence that fossil fuel dependence is not only becoming very much more costly and more risky, it's unhealthy and undemocratic. And Germany, as the world's fourth largest economy in the world, is starting to show that you can go to scale with renewable energy and still deliver on the economy. Sweden is another such example. So there are growing examples of a fourth pathway. And one way to link this fourth pathway to the globalized phase of development is the science that is starting to suggest that we need to define global sustainability criteria. One way of doing that is the work that we've put forward on planetary boundaries, which is quite simple. It's simply asking, what are the environmental processes we need to be stewards of at the planetary scale to maintain a Holocene equilibrium, the basis for a positive world development? And ask science, when you pass certain levels on control variables for climate, concentration of greenhouse gases, when do you enter a danger zone where we might see self-reinforcing feedbacks, tipping points that could take us in an unwanted direction? And the interesting thing is that science is starting to show for both, particularly oceans and climate, even for biodiversity, for global land areas, that we can start defining these boundaries. We know, for example, that for land, we've transformed 40% of the world's surface to agriculture and urban areas. We know now that we need to maintain the remaining natural ecosystems as a carbon sink. 25% of our emission of greenhouse gases are actually taken up by the remaining natural ecosystems. If we have this as a base, we could combine that with a new unified framework, which is based on the old Herman Daly steady-state economy thinking, to say that the economy must serve society, which must operate within a safe operating space of the Earth system. This is kind of changing the logic of development. Instead of saying growth first and then reduce environmental impacts, we try to argue that now we need to have the life support systems on Earth as the overarching boundary within which we can combine delivering on the Millennium Development Goals and a set of planetary must-haves. And I'll give you an example of how this could look like. But the point of it being a unified framework is really critical, which Simon also pointed out. It's not about developing and developed countries. It's about recognizing that we're all having to abide to sustainability criteria. Now, what does this mean for sustainable development? Well, it means actually burying this model, which is quite dramatic. This is the three pillars of sustainable development, the economic, social, and ecological. We've been operating that, I think, quite successfully. Kanin pointed out we've signed hundreds of multilateral environmental agreements. But I think we have to recognize that this has become largely a Mickey Mouse economy, where the economy has grown at the expense of the environment, natural and social capital. And that there is an opportunity now then to reshape this and move towards a model where we put the economy in service of society and put criteria to operate within the Earth system. Now, this is much more difficult than we can imagine, because it's a reshaping of the entire logic of development on Earth, and it requires that 193 countries start truly working together. We have recently put forward a paper in Nature to suggest how this could look like for the Global Sustainable Development Goals. The idea of transitioning from Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals. Now this is, and I agree with you, Simon, there's an enormous consultation and it's a big political discussion. Could this really work? And the MDGs, I would argue, have been a success in large extent. But there's no other agenda on the table today. This is the only way we could move from a situation from having just a narrative and a 7th goal in the MDGs, the environmental sustainability text in the MDG context, to a situation where we could have quantitative global sustainability targets within which we reach the social and economic targets. So what this suggests is that if you want to deliver clean energy in the world as one global development goal, you would start by setting your global carbon budget, just like Simon presented. We have 750 gigatons of carbon dioxide left to emit. And then you set your social targets and you say everyone has a right to a certain part of that cake, and we know that number quite well. We have to go down to roughly 1 ton of CO2 per capita. And then you can set a global carbon tax or a number of policy instruments to guide an innovation-based transition towards a clean energy future. And in fact, you could do that for every one of these goals on food, on energy, on transport, on biodiversity management. We could actually be based on agreements we have on paper and translate them to a new logic where we don't allow, so to say, the economy to just go first, but to be used as an innovation mechanism to deliver on global goals. Now the key is, and I'm coming to my closure here, is that that won't be enough. It won't be enough to set a ceiling of biophysical no-go areas because yes, it creates a safe operating space, but it creates an absolute space. You know, a carbon budget of 750 gigatons is an absolute budget. You know, a polluters pay system or some kind of market mechanism won't take you to that absolute budget because the rich will grab it all. I mean, wherever they live. So many NGOs have taken forward this donut model to say that there's a social equity-based floor that also needs to be defined. What's the minimum right of access to the remaining ecological space on a crowded planet? What has every citizen on Earth an ethical right to have access to in order to share the remaining space? This is drama at the highest scale. But this is the point where I would argue science has taken us in terms of evidence, that we need to start thinking of these two, the social floor and the biophysical ceiling of a unified framework. Something called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN, which Ban Ki-moon set up to find solutions towards sustainable development goals, have suggested that we need 10 goals. I won't go through only the 2 first, which is, of course, the unfinished business of the MDGs need to be delivered, ending extreme poverty. But look at the second goal, achieve development within planetary boundaries. This is underscored by Leadership Council, including people like Carl-Henrik Svanberg, the chair of British Petroleum, Ted Turner, the heads of all the big NGOs and UN agencies. This is quite a powerful message, the insight that this now has to occur. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development is taking global sustainability criteria and building them into their actions for 2020 to guide new business models. So something is happening in the world in terms of linking these things. There's a number of transitions that need to occur. And I'll just close with 2 of them, which is on energy and food. So the drama, of course, that occurs is that we need to recognize that these are big transformative changes towards a renewable energy future and a sustainable agriculture future, which moreover has to occur in ways that builds resilience. So it's not only okay to do effective delivery of services, we need to now build systems that are able to deal with shocks and disturbances I discussed earlier. So it's a new, so to say, level also of challenge, and the need to do this at the planetary scale. And there's a lot of evidence now being put forward that planetary stewardship and governance needs to be addressed at this planetary scale. Simon talked about the economy. Let me leave that for the discussion, that we need to then also rethink economics. So then just to close with a little bit of the half-full part, there is evidence to suggest that we can, in fact, succeed in this transition for agriculture. We can feed a world population on current land through sustainable means. It will require a new green revolution. It will require rethinking water, sanitation and nutrients, and how we manage land. We can come back to the innovation space there, but it's quite exciting that there's so much technologies and system knowledge that this is something that probably can be done. The global energy assessment show that we can succeed in this transition Simon put forward on energy. And final slide then, that we have taken forward a number of efforts of trying to emphasize that we need a dual track, therefore. We need to work with the obsolete economic model we're in right now, working with resource efficiency and then going beyond GDP and getting indicators of other values than just economics into our current model to act fast. We need policies and agreements on climate. But then, of course, this will require deeper thinking, the world transitioning into a circular economy, the world actually investing in new values. It is a deep transition, which will take time. So somehow we need to act on dual tracks. And this, I think, is a great, great challenge and opportunity for the development cooperation work in the world. Thank you.
Once again, thank you so much for your very interesting and also very informative presentations. Several people have asked us, the organizers, if we can share your PowerPoint presentations, and you can. So we will see to that they are presented at FUF's webpage, and perhaps also the other organizers will be able to present them. And perhaps through the mailing lists, give you information when you can find the information there. Now it's time for us to listen to you discussing in between each other. So I would like Simon, who was first off, to start commenting on the other presentations. And you can do that freely, and I'll give you 5 minutes to do so.
That's an unexpected treat. Shall I use the microphone? Well, look, first of all, they were completely fascinating and really complimentary, and I loved actually the depth and the detail that you had, and also you, Johan. A couple of things worry me about this whole debate around the issue of whether there are losers as well as winners. And I think that, Johan, particularly, we can present the move towards a sustainable economy as being about innovation and about sustainability being achieved at the same time as human development. But actually it's quite difficult, and there will be losers from the changes we make. You put up the price of electricity, and people who are suffering from fuel poverty will be worse off. You make air travel more expensive, and people will complain because they can't go to Thailand on holiday. You make public transport more effective, but then people complain they can't drive from A to B. And both of you are in different ways interested in the politics of change, and so am I. And so I guess the question is, how do we not just vision the change we want, but actually how do we deliver it? And I'm interested to know whether you think it's about leadership, is it about policy design, is it about delivery, and how do we balance those three things? Because it's easy to be aspirational. But it's really difficult to make change happen. And I look at the international negotiations on climate as an example, and they're really hard. They're really, really hard. And Ban Ki-moon's going to have a summit next year for leaders. But I suspect that persuading Barack Obama that there's a problem isn't the problem. You know, the problem is persuading the Tea Party in Congress that there's a problem, and they won't be invited to the summit. So I'd like you both, if I'm allowed to ask a question, I might, just to talk a little bit about winners, losers, trade-offs, sequencing, and how do we actually deliver the kind of change we're all talking about. Am I allowed to ask a question, or does that break the rules?
Why don't you comment upon Candy's presentation, also bringing in inequality and growing inequality in some areas of the world?
Well, indeed, but I think that what's interesting about Candy's presentation is also what she had to say about institutions, because she was also in this political terrain, and we were having breakfast together, as one does in a hotel, and talking about Zambia. And right across Africa, we see this problem of jobless growth, and in countries which have natural resource riches, of which Zambia is one, it's easy to have rapid growth and even easy to have big export revenues and even tax revenues. But then managing the translation of that into jobs for people is about how you capture the tax revenue and use it in a way which is consensual. So in the end, development is about politics. And sometimes we're facile about, well, sometimes we make very strong points about politics. Let me not say facile. If you read the high-level panel on post-2015, it draws a lot on David Cameron's speeches about the golden thread. And the golden thread is about the link between property rights and the rule of law, and openness and democracy and growth and poverty reduction. And what researchers say about that is it's easy to say that if you come to Sweden or the UK, you can see all those things. You can tick the box about property rights and democracy. But the question is, if you haven't got those things, where do you start? What do you do first? And how do you build momentum behind a kind of liberal society? And there is, of course, a literature on that. So that seems to me to be the interesting territory, is around how do we create the politics of change.
I'm sure we will get back to you before we get to the audience. Kenny, please.
No, thank you for that, and it's a pleasure to be sandwiched here between, maybe it's a height thing, you know, it's one of these graphs. But first to say, I think what came out for me very strongly is that there's more singular agendas that we've been following, which are often more ideology-driven than reality-driven. We've just got to stop, because if you go with the kind of growth-only agenda that's going to do it for everyone, or if you go with, on the other extreme, that is all about reducing poverty, it's not doing it, and the evidence is clear. Just as much as the evidence is clear on the science, on what's happening on the environment and the climate change side. So whether it's on the social science side, the climate change science, the evidence is there. And yet we're letting ideology drive the decisions. The second is, I think, a very good point made at the end of the day, that our politics is still local. Because, I mean, you are not voting for the leader in China or in Zambia, right? So your leaders are responding to you as the public. And so that's where I think the role of the public debate, public information is so critical. Because you are not casting anymore a local vote. You are voting for leaders who have to play big on the global stage. So one has to also, although I think leadership matters tremendously, I think also public leadership matters. Because we are choosing the leaders who now have to make decisions that are not only about local politics. So they can't say anymore and hide behind the fact that, you know, we often hear when it comes to the aid debate, oh, but you know, our taxpayers, you know, the taxpayer wants to see how many children were fed in Uganda. And I'm not sure that that's all the taxpayer wants to see. But if the taxpayer is not speaking out as to what the taxpayer wants to see, then it's easy to fall back into that and say, well, let's just count the numbers. You know, and so I think we've got a tremendous, as a global polity, we have a role and a responsibility to play beyond. And that's, I think, something that both the presentations by Simon and Johan, for me also, brought together. And then I think at the end of the day, coming now to also to how Johan closed, we have the data, we have the evidence, we have the science, we have the technology. No more are these crutches again that we can, or shields we can hide from, saying, you know, we really don't know. We do know. So we can make the right choices and shift the incentive and make this global local agenda one. Because while I agree that a crack in the glass comes a lot from the lack of sustainability of the path we're going forward, I would say that lack of sustainability, while it's critical to look at it from the lens of environment, it's also critical to look at it from the lens of inequality and injustice. Because that burns big holes in society. It's not against poverty that people rise to the streets. It's against injustice. So local injustice, global injustice, to me, these are the cracks. And we know enough to make the right choices and put in place the right incentives and institutions So it's holding both our leaders to account, but as a public, stepping up to say we want to see something different.
It seems kind of that you agree a lot, but do you disagree with some of the parts of the presentation of Simon? He now addressed a question to Johan about how will we deal with the losers? There will be losers. Equality will not be possible, perhaps.
No, I think, fundamentally, I think the three presentations, although I did have I shared some scrambled eggs with Simon at breakfast, but we didn't actually discuss our presentations. It was interesting to see, because we were talking about the politics of development. And I think I would come in very strongly to say that we've got to, move away from what has been maybe too much technocracy moving the choices and the log frames. But I mean, that's not a disagreement. That is to agree with what Simon put up there. I think our perspectives because of where we sit, prioritize issues differently. But I think you'll see the line between the three, in a sense, even if we come at it from different perspectives, really at the end of the day, calling for a different approach to this. I still, even though I put up a lot of data up there also that the financing of development is looking very different, I'm a strong believer that at the end of the day, it's the critical value of choosing the right incentives and the right investments will make the difference.
Thank you.
Let me start by reflecting a bit on Simon's first question about winners and losers. Now you'll think that my only reference point is The Economist, which it is not, but I must refer to The Economist again, which is, you may have seen this wonderful front page of a dinosaur with a petrol pump a few weeks back, and they making a very, very, typically strong economist analysis that irrespective of climate change, there's no doubt that the oil industry, if it continues on its business as usual path, will be the dinosaurs of tomorrow. There's so much evidence to show that kilowatt-hour price on electricity, the transition towards a solar-powered world economy, that 25% of electricity delivery in Germany actually originates from decentralized solar and wind today through their feed-in tariff system, is coming to scale to a point where it might be self-propelling into a direction where, compared to the risks and costs of offshore, even natural gas in the end, because we're not fully accounting for the full costs of shale gas, for example, neither methane or fresh water or chemicals, nor the fact that the profit margins are actually most likely lower than are accounted for, because there's a willingness to show the market that this is very prominent, more prominent than in fact the economy shows. You may be aware that the US today operates at natural gas prices, which is half the gas prices in China even. So this is creating an export benefit for the US, which exceeds even the labor cost benefit in China. So these are big, big issues for an industry that may in fact be going or coming to the beginning of the end. The difficulty in my mind is when Carl-Henrik Svanberg, chair of British Petroleum, makes clear just 2 days back in New York that they've taken the conclusion that we have another 30 years of cheap energy from fossil sources, particularly because of shale gas. They see, and I think they're right, that there's no other way of lifting poor people out of poverty without having cheap energy. It's the model we're in. We can plot GDP against energy. It's a linear relationship. So the pragmatic conclusion is all the time that we're sort of stuck in our current development model. We cannot break it because it's so successful in delivering on the short term. So then the question is how to break it. And I would argue that the only way to break it is building on the insights that, scattered on islands, we have the technologies to deliver clean energy. And energy is so perfect because it has perfect substitution. Nobody of us in this room cares if it is oil or if it is sun that has created the electricity that operates this mic. So it's a perfect substitution. We can have perfect human well-being with a fossil fuel or renewable energy system. And therefore what we need is leadership, and we need big global regulatory decisions. We clearly need to rapidly get, I mean, just imagine a situation where you would actually have a global carbon tax of 30, 40 US dollars per ton of carbon dioxide. It will probably immediately stir a transition towards a renewable energy future, just immediately. And you might say, rightly, that this is utopia today, but we've done it before. With the Montreal Protocol, we didn't have a tax on chlorofluorocarbons. We forbid them entirely. We simply said stop. Nobody's suggesting a stop on carbon dioxide, but just to put a price on carbon dioxide. And the paradox is that even a person like Carl-Henrik Svanberg then ends to say, it's not reasonable that we can use the atmosphere free of charge. No, it's not reasonable. It's actually very unreasonable, particularly because the brunt of the cost is taken by the poorest nations in the world. So we're really shoving a cost across other communities. So I think there is, you know, we shouldn't be surprised if we can get a breakthrough, which is, you know, away from the incremental. Right now, there's no promise of that, but I think there is so much bubbling in terms of concern, so much bubbling in terms of opportunity, that we might come to a point in Paris 2015 at the COP21, where the global deal is to be set, where we might actually have a surprise breakthrough, because things are starting to get together towards a point where it's becoming more attractive to invest in a new pathway. And I think the answer, Simon, is we need to combine global leadership to spur local innovation. I don't think there's another way. The Copenhagen Accord track is, as you know, the reverse, to say we can't get a global deal, it's impossible, so therefore let's only rely on aspirational pledges from below. I don't know if you've seen the add up. If you add up all the pledges in the world, it barely bends the emission curve. I mean, it just on the margin shows a little dent. It adds up to nothing. So it doesn't work. Somehow we need to break that. And then just my final comment on the three presentations. I think they complement each other in a very nice way. And the key, I think, is, to me, is Simon's reflection on where development aid is moving, from the spanner to the spring. And I think that's actually quite a dangerous development. I think it's really important that development cooperation agencies like SIDA do not get rid of the spanners. We need the people who knows the substance to be able to provide integrated strategies on profile areas where we think, as Sweden, that we can contribute as our thinking. Because I think you're right, Simon. Actually, countries like Sweden represent quite an interesting model of how to create well-being through at least reasonable strategies for sustainability while having good welfare. And there's something here that we're dismantling the Swedish profile in all our Swedish development cooperation, and I think that's a mistake. So, you know, I would hold on to some of those old spanners.
I think you should comment on that, Simon, perhaps.
Of course, this is not a meeting about climate change, but kind of climate change illustrates so many of the problems that we're going to have to deal with. At national level, you see really interesting attempts to balance the winners and losers. Australia is supposed to have the most advanced legislation in the world, although with the new government they're now promising to remove the proposed carbon tax. But they introduced a model in which energy prices went up a lot, but everybody in the country was better off. And that was very cleverly managed as a piece of policy design. Energy prices went up, but income tax rates went down and social security went up, so that household budgets were unaffected. Companies were faced with the prospect of having to pay for carbon, but they were given time to adjust, and there was a large innovation fund created that would promulgate the kinds of technologies that Johan was thinking about. So that's fantastic, actually. It was therefore a policy that went through without having too much complaint about it. North Africa, I think it might be Morocco or Tunisia, very large fuel subsidies, as there are in many countries, over $400 billion worth of fuel subsidies in the world. A really careful program to reduce fuel subsidies, first of all with a lot of education of people of why this was a problem, the fiscal cost and so on, but then also carefully targeted compensation mechanisms so that people weren't worse off if fuel prices went up. Principles of policy design we could probably apply also at an international level. I have to say I'm at the moment less optimistic than you are about the possibility of a deal in 2015, but I think that neither of you said much about Europe as a vehicle, and interestingly enough, Sweden has one of the lowest proportions of its aid budget going through Brussels of any country in Europe, just because of the way the treaties work and the contributions and the generous size of your aid budget. Connie Hedegaard, though, did a really good job around the Durban platform and building consensus, making alliances with the least developed countries and with the South. Really good example of the spring skills that we need in order to deliver a climate deal. I want to say one more thing about climate, which is that people talk all the time about mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is about windmills and solar cells, adaptation is about dikes, and people think they've dealt with climate. Actually, one of the things we learned from Johan's presentation is that the whole world economy is going to change as a result of either climate change itself or the actions we take on climate change. China exports 27 billion euros worth of solar panels to Europe every year. This is not about China dealing with its own climate change, it's about China spotting a niche where it can sell things, because they don't have very much installed solar in China. Bolivia is sitting on $3 trillion worth of reserves of lithium, essential mineral for the next wave of electric motors. You could develop a whole industrialization strategy for Bolivia based on exploiting lithium, making new batteries. This is not about climate change in Bolivia, it's about Bolivia finding a niche in the world. So if you have any tradable sector in any country, including Zambia, and you're not investing in energy efficiency, but the Swedes are, you become less competitive. If you're not investing in new technology, but the Swedes are, you become less competitive. Every tradable sector in every country of the world is going to be revolutionized by what happens on climate change. So it's really important for countries not just to think about windmills and dikes, but to think about their industrial policy and how they're going to change. Is that enough to deliver a deal in 2015? There are some huge blockages, and because there are potentially some very big losers, all these oil companies that have the discounted value of the net present value of all their oil reserves built into their balance sheets, for example, are going to resist having a climate deal. I think we need to think about, go back to my slide about how do you get global collective action to work. There's a lot about trust and building institutions, but there's also a big issue about how do you structure the incentives? And the question is, why would any company or any country want to deal with this? And how do we make it more attractive to them, punish them if they don't?
So less optimistic about the possible outcomes of the climate negotiations, which actually is one of the big frameworks that is already in place, but we will see how we will manage to use it with shared responsibilities, both when it comes to mitigation, but also to pay for the climate finance in the Global South. Kenny, would you like to? You think we should open the floor? Johan, do you think so too? Okay. I would like, though, you to comment before I open up, because I have one question. None of you have mentioned that we have actually a framework in Europe and also in Sweden, which is the Policy Coherence for Development. Development Commissioner at the European level, but also here in Sweden, have the responsibility to follow up on coherence. Do you have some experience that, or comments on that?
I say, your turn.
No, I mean I can just say it's a good ambition on paper, but we're not seeing much coherence, so to say. I mean, there are two dimensions of that coherence, as far as I'm concerned. One is the coherence in terms of many nations working in an integrated, concerted way when investments are made to truly support development. I mean, that's one thing. But I think the more challenging thing today is to have coherence in terms of doing what I think we're flagging here very clearly, is that you can no longer separate environment from social, from economic development. There is, in my mind, no such thing as environment any longer. It's all about development, security, and human well-being. And how do we come to a point where the ministries for the environment and the ministries for development cooperation, which, you know, we simply have to admit play a second-rank role in terms of the influence on the European political agenda, are central stage in terms of influencing policy. I think that's the more interesting coherence challenge, to be able to kind of raise these issues to the prominence that they deserve.
And if you would be the Prime Minister, how would you organize your people?
Well, the question is if I'm Prime Minister in Sweden or Earthland.
Choose.
But let's, well, that's of course an impossible question. But I would say that there is, you know, a great opportunity and necessity today to experiment with new ideas that we might not be certain of will actually work, but where it is very clear that we need to test. So, for example, I think it would be extremely interesting to take a stance and say, dear friends, we can no longer afford to lose any more biodiversity on Earth. We simply need a global agreement that we've come to a point where we need to have this as a global common good and work together and put funding in place to enable the Bolivias, the Colombias, the Congos in the world to manage these remaining biomes in the world in a way that preserves and secures resilience for all economies in the world. That's a grand idea. There's similar type of structures being thought of left and right in science and NGOs, and even in the Aichi targets, in fact, of the UN Convention for Biodiversity. But, you know, to be brave enough to step forward and say, now it's time to test such a grand idea, and we need one grand idea on climate. If we could get a grand idea on climate and one on biodiversity tested, I think that would be very exciting. And to follow on Simon's point finally, that, you know, we make the big mistake to think that if we have a regulatory measure like a tax or a price, it's as if that money disappears. But, you know, if you have a transparent, effective government, of course that money doesn't disappear. You can either shift it so you lower income tax. In fact, you could have zero income tax. In my country, you would have zero income tax and a high tax on natural capital. And you would do that shift as a point to get people to work, and you would simply do only sustainable business right across the whole society. And you know what would happen then? People would move sustainably, not based on enormous insight and having listened to science. They would move on indifference. Indifference would turn into our biggest asset, because then it would be cheaper to do right than to do wrong. So you wouldn't consume the cheapest tomato in the shop, because that tomato would be much, much more expensive, because a sustainable one would be cheaper. So indifference would be the tool to a global transition. Sounds boring, but it would be quite an exciting, I wouldn't get any votes, I'm sure. but I mean, it's just to show that we're so wrong today when doing wrong is cheaper than doing right. And I think that's one of the movements. But my point is more, allow ourselves to experiment. I mean, when did we last time experiment in a big way on global collaboration? Well, it was after the Second World War. We haven't experimented much for 50 years. Isn't it time to experiment again? And I think that would be quite an interesting effort, which requires leadership.
I will soon let you in. I just wanted, Kenny, Johan was saying that we need some of the experience from the development cooperation sector when now starting up a different framework, also integrating SDGs. Would you like to comment on how we can use the experience of this good in theory exercise with the policy for coherence that we have?
I would, but I would very much also like to hear from the floor if that's all right, because I think sometimes, I mean, we can talk to each other for a long time, but it would be very good to just get some ideas also from the floor, and then I'd like to come back to that, if that's all right.
Yeah. Okay, now I will listen to you. Please raise your hands and tell us who you are. Keep it as questions and comments, no lectures, because then I will tell you to stop. And Ylva, you have mic. Let's start here.
Thank you, Åsa Smeller. I would like to pick up on Simon's idea of some of the basic leadership issues, and say that to change policy we need a changed leadership. And thinking in that term, I would like to take up one of the examples that you had, and which we are painfully aware of the lack of progress in mortality, what you call it, mother's mortality. There are joining factors. The white elephant in the room is that women are not in charge of much of the decision making. We can see it all over the world where women are only a part of the political force, etc. They are hindered by laws who don't give them access to resources or to owning their own resources or even their own bodies. I would like the panel to comment on the change in the leadership model while changing the roles of women and men in the future.
Thank you. We will take some more questions before letting you answer, so please take notes.
My name is Bertil Odén. After this enormous information-dense presentation, I would like to ask one question, which is regarding what would be the first steps to, according to your perspectives here, to bridge some of the gaps between this growth within limit perspective, the inequality and social perspective, and the, let's say, traditional development perspective. And how do we, and if you could comment on the gigantic pedagogical task to teach the people in those various circles about what the other circles should demand. And the second part is, given that the multilateral organizations are as inadequate as the bilateral to or more or less to meet the new global challenges that Simon was discussing in the beginning, what would be the first steps to try to remodel or create new organizations, given the fact that it's impossible to close down any of those that are already existing? Thank you.
Okay, one more question. Maybe we have a question on this side. Yes, please.
Joachim Rådström is my name. I would just like to ask you, you have been speaking of the need to come together in a grand international scale to preserve and safeguard, let's say, valuable natural resources and so on. And as we speak, we already have petrol boats circling around the Arctic Circle and wanting to drill there. But we have managed to set up internationally binding treaties for instance, Antarctica, not to extract minerals and so on there. So is the situation different today? Do we lack too much leadership? Are we, let's say, sacrificing environmental safety because of diplomatic leniency? Or are we so sort of hungry for these oil reserves, these new opportunities, that we all of a sudden have forgotten the climate change that led to it?
Thank you. First, a question about gender and leadership, and I think all of you should answer, not only the woman in the panel. And then, and this is very interesting, I think, what would be the first steps to enter into this new paradigm? And how should we explain to people that we need to take these steps? What to do with the multilaterals? You say that it will be possible to close them. What to do then? Maybe some comment on the Green Global Fund for Climate Finance would be interesting to, if I could add. And then also, I mean, what could we do with the extractive industry? Is it possible to limit? And maybe a comment on the Arctic Council and the work within the Arctic Council would be interesting also. Who would like to start? Simon, you have the mic.
These are very interesting and different questions. Would women produce a different way of thinking about the world? Well, I mean, undoubtedly should have a gender-specific perspective on all these issues. And we should try to be collaborative, and a lot of the collective action theory is much more female in a way than it is male. And I think actually we do have a big opportunity, and this is also about the gaps. In the next year, I think you have an election coming up relatively soon, but I work a lot on European development cooperation, and we have next year both the European elections for the European Parliament and a new Commission. And one of the urgent tasks that we face in the development community is to try and make sure that the values and the practicalities of a new development policy are visible in that election. And I don't know how the debate is in Sweden, but aid is constantly under pressure in a certain section of the press in the UK, in what we call the Daily Mail tendency, where the solution to our austerity problem is to stop, we stop immigration and stop giving aid, and therefore everything will be fine. But where the aid discussion is a little bit focused on what I think of as old aid rather than new development. So the question is how do we, I mean, if you think about how leadership works, the first thing leaders have to do is to create a vision and sell the vision and build consensus around the vision. And whether that's done by men or women, the vision has to be rounded and coherent and complete. So who is making the case for this new development? Who is standing up and saying to people, you have to understand that unless we solve these global problems, our own prosperity is at risk? And we've talked a lot about climate, but is equally true of the financial crisis, of how we manage globalization, and about how we create resilience, actually, in the world economy. I just want to give you one example, which was in the papers the other day, which I thought was completely fascinating. There's a small town in Pakistan called Sialkot, which used to produce most of the world's footballs. There were 100,000 people working in the football industry sewing footballs. The time of the last World Cup, FIFA changed the specification of the football by less than, I think, 1% to make it more round. By changing the specification, a piece of institutional change somewhere far, far away from Sialkot, it made it impossible for the hand sewers to compete in the football industry. And all the production shifted to Thailand and China, where they use machines to make footballs. Of the 100,000 jobs in Sialkot sewing footballs, 90,000 disappeared. There are only a few people left because only a few football leagues in the world use hand-sewn footballs. This, for me, is a completely fascinating illustration of the interdependence that we've been talking about today, that an institutional change taken by old men in suits in Geneva causes the loss of 90,000 jobs in Pakistan. So what we need are political leaders who will talk to us about that kind of interdependence and then construct the policies. I'm very frightened that if we have a European election next year, it will be dominated by very parochial concerns. It will be focused on issues like immigration and austerity, and we won't create that vision. So we have a huge demand for female leaders and male leaders to make that case.
The change of the multilateral institutions?
Yeah, well, I think that we can see that. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career in the UN, and I'm a strong believer in UN. I don't like the G20 because it seems to me to undermine the UN, and we should try to get these things back. But we have to be very demanding of the UN, and it's completely infuriating to see the way in which good policy is just submerged and buried in the UN. The high-level panel on sustainability before the Rio+20 conference did a really good job. And then you look at the outcome document from Rio+20, and even the word sustainability and green growth and all these things, very unpopular, completely lost in G77 versus G8 debates. I think we have to change the incentives. And I'll just give you one example of that very quickly. When the high-level panel on One UN was undertaking its work some years ago, Gordon Brown, who was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was one of the co-chairs, along with Stoltenberg from Norway and somebody else. And they came to London, and they had a meeting in number 11 Downing Street, and I was asked to make the presentation about the future of the UN. And it went very badly, mainly because I made a joke. And I think somebody said to me in advance, please don't make a joke because Gordon Brown doesn't like jokes. It was a joke about Gordon. Anyway, yeah, I made the joke. I thought, you know, who am I to be told? I made a joke. Bad idea. It wasn't a very funny joke either. They produced a report, and then just before the report was published, the British ministers had a little bit of a panic attack, and they had a lunch for ambassadors and high commissioners in London because they could see the G77 were going to reject One UN as being a takeover by the developed countries. And indeed, the recommendations made were absolutely the minimal ones. Better coordination at country level, which is kind of, if you forgive me saying this, the most boring conclusion they could have reached. How could they have done it differently? This comes to your question. At that point, the UN was receiving about $15 billion a year from donors, from countries, including developing countries. Everyone was talking about doubling aid, and everyone was talking about budget support with a 3 or 5 year horizon. So let's not talk about 15 billion, let's talk about 30 billion a year, and let's take a 5 year horizon. That makes $150 billion. Now, if the rich countries had said to the G77, look, here's a check for $150 billion to support the UN's work for the next 5 years in a democratic, accountable, representative way. But by the way, just before we hand it over, we'd like to talk about some reforms to the UN. They would have had a completely different conversation. And we wouldn't just be doing country-level One UN stuff. We'd be looking at the whole UN system in a much more pragmatic way. And I think we are just not ambitious enough and not actually ruthless enough in applying the lessons of collective action to change the incentive structure facing the players. We can do it if we have the leadership and the will and the determination.
Go ahead.
All right, let me let me respond on the issue of leadership. I think, you know, the world is made up of over 50% of women. And yet we have these arduous conversations whether our leadership, our policies, our laws should be 50-50. Yeah. So let me start by saying, if you put all of that stuff away, it's the right thing to do. It's how we are made up. So even the conversations that women are more nurturing and caring and collaborative, and we've never said that about why the other half has always been 90% of the representation. In Zambia, women are 11% in parliament, just 11%. And the conversation is, oh, they're not strong enough, no one votes for them, really, they're not ready. Women will say, we are not ready, this is a dirty game, we don't want to get into it. They are 52% of the population. They vote more than men do. They actually turn up and vote. So I think we've also got to go back to trying to look for reasons why and just do the right thing. Because there are a lot of choices in the policy and legal mix that are coming out so skewed because there isn't that voice and representation in decision-making bodies. So we've got to stop hiding behind these traditions and cultures and just do the right thing.
I didn't want to say that I'm not in favour of quotas, but are you in favour of quotas?
You know, I've had this debate with the leadership in Zambia who said, when I said, you know, maybe it's time actually to think of some special measures, because if we're going to wait for culture to change, you and I are going to be very old and our children are going to be very old. And it's not going to change. And so there's been an interesting shift also in many African countries of moving to different types of affirmative action efforts, so that it at least kicks into gear some things that are otherwise so culturally and institutionally dominant that just waiting for the winds of change isn't going to cut it.
So that means yes.
The answer is a clear yes.
I also heard a clear yes.
On multilateralism, I just two things. One, it was our Secretary General, I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly in the local language, but Doug Hammarskjöld, who actually rests in Ndola in Zambia, who said that we've got to stop talking about the United Nations as someone else's abstract Picasso painting and think about it as a drawing we make ourselves. So you've got to look at it as a system that belongs to you, and not just the 191 leaders who sit there and cannot come to a decision, because as Johan said, when we put all of our inadequacies and our indifference together, we're not coming up with things that dramatically change the world. Now, to take Simon's point, it's interesting that the lowest common denominator that they did agree when it comes to UN reform, although that's not all about the multilateral system, was let them experiment with one UN and delivering as one at the country level, because that's a safe space and they can kind of, you know. Now, what is happening, and that was the difference in this GA that's now going on, is they can see the tremendous change of how the UN is behaving in those countries where we're actually delivering as one. And in Zambia, our #1 supporter to the UN coming together and delivering as one, because it doesn't just happen through love and fresh air, is Sweden. It's Sweden and Ireland, not heavy financial hitters in Zambia, but who've taken a critical decision that they are going to support that. And within 3 years, you would be amazed. It is like night and day. So sometimes this experimentation, daring to be different, actually can come from places that is not the large global stage. But now we need the guts at the global stage to say, look at what's happening in these places. So why can't we now look at that and do it globally? So it's a matter of actually it can happen, it has happened, it's not just aspirational. So look at what you are supporting in these countries and demand that change, because we've shown it can be done differently.
Can you give us some practical examples of how what
Sure.
has become different?
If you look at 2 or 3 big areas where we work on a programmatic level, if I take the health agenda, we were probably a scatter of about 160 tiny projects across the UN system. We now have one program that focuses very much on what are the major triggers that are causing infant, child, and maternal deaths. We're all in it together as 6 agencies, one program, one set of common results, and really talking through a single set of policy choices, data sets, etc., so that we're not also confusing our partners on what's happening, what do we stand for, etc. Now, when I come to the policy side, we've taken up tough human rights issues behind one voice and saying this is what we stand for. And the access that we are given to have those conversations on some of the most toughest, contentious issues is significant. But we stand as one UN behind those positions. And it really, you may take that for granted, but one mustn't. And it really comes also with doing joint analysis, having common data, doing our field work together. It has cut costs tremendously, but even more so, it has really brought the normative and the operational agenda together, and we deliver much more powerfully. And then, believe me, we are unbeatable. So.
You did not mention, though, the environmental aspects. Have you been able to integrate them?
Much more difficult, but what's happening now is the reality of global climate shocks really touching home. And whether we look at it, I mean, there's a new conversation on renewables which wouldn't have happened unless this was brought even to household level, because again, we vote based on whether we feel we are ourselves and our families are doing better or not. And it's the global agenda is now a local agenda on the environment side. So for Zambians who've lost income, lost jobs, seen water and forests disappear, they're really starting to realize sooner rather than later that this agenda is theirs, and then therefore voting with their feet. So I think this is no longer a choice issue. It is at the heart of the fact that the social, I think it's correct, those three circles with the predominance of the economic is way over. And if not balanced, I would say putting the people at the heart of it is really what's changing that pattern. But I want to leave you with a thought of why it is important that every single one of us are in this, and we can't just look and say this is someone else's, or we cannot change things. It really, I think this has been said, it was said by Margaret Mead, and it has been picked up today. We even see it on the Apple website. It takes a few caring and committed people to change the world. And in fact, if I take that even further, it is a few crazy people who think that they can change the world that always have. And so I hope I'm talking to a room of crazy people.
Thank you. Johan, and I just remind you about the question we have not touched upon yet, and that's about extractive industry and also...
And the Arctic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll touch the Arctic, and I'll go very fast so I come to the Arctic, but I just wanted to say how much I agree with you, Kanye, and I think that's a part of hope, that it's not necessarily at the heart a gender issue. It's about persons and about brave leadership. I think it's fantastic that Angela Merkel wins her third term yesterday, but she has a PhD in physics, and that's not too bad. To be a female leader with a PhD in physics, she understands these issues. So she has this brilliant combination of competence and female leadership. I wonder when we had a PhD holder last in the Swedish government. It's many decades ago. I won't enter the quota discussion at all. Let me just say we've tried men for a few millennia. Perhaps it's time to try something new. And the only thing we know about development cooperation is that investing in girls is the best thing we know. We know for a fact that changes everything with regards to population growth, with regards to openness and equity and transparency, and also with regards to balance and competence in economic development. So no doubt there is a big reward to be held there. On the first steps in the UN, I would argue that perhaps the most important reform would be to allow majority decisions in the Security Council and in the General Assembly, to allow for the big conventions to take majority decisions. That's what's blocking everything today, that we have a consensus-based process in the climate negotiations. We cannot allow the Saudi Arabias in this world to block action on climate change, which is the case today. And that would open up an enormous opportunity to get the UN really to move forward much, much more fast. The issue whether pedagogics is a big task, I mean, now I'll be really kind of arguing against my own task, which is a lot about communicating science. But I think it's dangerous if we lock ourselves too much in the belief that we have to erase uncertainty and erase ignorance to be able to act, because we will never erase uncertainty, we'll never erase all ignorance. We simply need to recognize that some very difficult decisions will have to be taken top down, and then you'll see, I think, that societies will move along. I find it absolutely astonishing. We published this, as you may have seen yesterday in Dagens Nyheter, another year in a row where almost 80% of the Swedish population is deeply concerned about climate change and wants to move faster than the political leadership. 80%. That's absolutely astonishing for any question with regards to, let's say, the political agenda. And finally, then on the Arctic.
In the weapons export from Sweden as well. That's also 80% more.
So it just shows that, you know, a big experiment, a big brave decision, and you would probably get a lot of political support. Kofi Annan has said once, we know what to do, but we don't know how to get reelected once we've done it. And I would argue he's wrong. I think you would even get re-elected today. Now on the Arctic, yes, of course, this is the big paradox that here we have one of the most sensitive biomes in the world putting up a red flag, Mother Earth putting up a red flag, warning humanity that you're going too far. And the first issue is the opportunities of extracting gas, oil, and mineral resources. And how to deal with this? I think we have to learn from the Antarctic Treaty. Now remember that expires 2049, so there's already a concern that we're approaching a point where even the Antarctica could open up. So here again, the Arctic Council can and should play a very decisive role. Now the Arctic Council is a weak institution in terms of, you know, kind of compulsory hard political measures. But I think that both Sweden in its chairmanship and now Canada can play an important role in trying to raise the regulatory framework to, let's say, protect the Arctic. The problem is, as you may be aware, I mean, the Arctic is predominantly a victim of change. I mean, it's global change hitting the Arctic. It's not as if the Arctic can change its internal management and somehow put a fence around itself. That won't do. There's no bubble to put on the Arctic. So the Arctic is, in my mind, the manifestation, the ultimate first manifestation of the need for urgent global action, way, way beyond the Arctic. And that is, I think, the challenge.
Thank you. Yes, you can.
I'm just curious about all these multilateral environment agreements, of which there are hundreds, as you rightly said, including Kyoto, which many of them have no teeth. So do they work really? And under what circumstances do people adhere to these agreements, and under what condition do they just break them?
In fact, we counted them once. There are more than 500. No, they don't work. And the interesting thing is that I would see an opportunity here in the following way. You know, when the Millennium Development Goals were written, I don't know the exact ins and outs, but apparently already up till 5 to 12, there were no MDGs. There was panic. There were a lot of very, very bright people backing up the political leadership. The political leadership is saying, we need something to put on the table. There was nothing there. And in the last second, there was a very, very intelligent, concerted effort to simply say, what do we have? What have we already agreed upon? And they scanned through all these conventions and just took already agreed upon text and just put it on paper. So there's not one goal in the MDGs which is not something that everyone had already agreed upon, and then it was put together in one package, and nobody could decline it, because when everyone stepped up and complained, oh, but you've already signed this one. You've signed that you are prepared to half hunger and half poverty. And so it went through and became an integrated endeavor which the world largely has been delivering against. I think you can do exactly the same thing today. You can take the goodies out of every convention. The Convention on Biodiversity is a brilliant text. The Climate Convention is a good text, etc., etc. And just take the best parts of those and build a framework, and then you put it hard to the table. This is the Integrated Sustainable Development Goals agenda, and nobody will be able to refuse you because you've already undersigned it. And then you could get a higher order power hierarchy to run with that. Not the ministers for the environment, but the Carl Bildts of this world, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the prime ministers of the world, to own this. I mean, I think we both share, Simon, that, you know, this picture 3 o'clock in the morning from Copenhagen, when Gordon Brown and Obama and Fredrik Reinfeldt sits there, Angela Merkel, all tired, trying to fight over the failed Copenhagen Agreement. It's always portrayed as the ultimate manifestation of failure. In my mind, this is the ultimate signal of success, because this is the first time it stepped from being an environmental issue to be a true issue for prime ministers. They then recognize 3 o'clock in the morning, my goodness, this will reshape my economy. This will change everything in my country. Of course it was difficult. That's why they sat there scratching their head. It was too late and very depressing that it was supposed to be the end of a journey, not the beginning of the journey. It became the beginning of the journey, but it somehow at least changed the game slightly. Then politicians went into a post-Copenhagen trauma, and they're still there, but there's always something happened there which at least places this a bit higher in the agenda, and this could be one way.
So what you say is that we are very well prepared now to take the first steps. We can just
Are we,
rely
Simon?
on things that we have already been thinking about for a long time. And you also presented a very interesting idea about taking decisions in majority in the UN at the same time as believing in top-down decisions. This is a good mixture, I think. Time has ended. Do we have some burning questions in the audience? No. But then I think it's time, and Rolf will thank our panel, and I would like to thank the audience. Please go into the web pages of the organizers, and you will find the presentations and a lot more interesting information.
Well, thank you so much. I started by saying that we would like to look a bit at the wider picture. We certainly did that to have an idea of some of the challenges and implications for development policy. We certainly got that, and even some insights into the house. I think you have convinced us that the glass is half full, but we're also very much aware of the crack in the glass. And to refer to your quote from The Economist, we are still slightly nervous, maybe. But maybe nervousness is a trigger for action. But thank you so much. It was really very valuable. And as a small token of our appreciation, very small thing, it's actually in the spirit of the meeting, it's a fair trade product. So there you are. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.